Vantor, delivering sovereign spatial intelligence that gives nations the ground truth.
Hello and welcome back. I'll come to events much closer to home in a moment, but it seems that war in the Persian Gulf has broken out again between the US and Iran, to no one's particular surprise, and especially not to regular listeners to this podcast. I saw the government was quick to call on Iran to abide by the ceasefire, but I don't know whether Iran is entirely to blame. I have no independent information about what is happening on the ground, but I don't regard the utterances of the US, Iran, and especially Israel to be particularly trustworthy. And in this context, I assume our Wedgetail early warning and control aircraft is still operating from the UAE in what the government describes as a defensive role. The only problem is you can't control what others do with the data coming from the Australian aircraft once it reaches them. I assume it is going directly to UAE and US command and control nodes. That's radar data, that's electronic warfare data, and what they do with the vast quantity of the information that they receive from the Australian asset is up to them, including, I imagine, some or all of it is being passed to Israel. Assuming I am correct, I'm not sure how this can be classified as a purely defensive operation, and that's something the Australian public might like to know a little bit more about. But to events close to home, and a lot has been happening, we have a new security treaty with Fiji, and that's a good thing. It's a mutual defence pact, and Australia, as a much larger country, can certainly defend Fiji. What can Fiji do to defend Australia? That's unclear, as Fiji has no defence industry. Tourism is the main source of income, and it has a population of about 900,000. However, the experts tell me that their soldiers are very highly thought of on US peacekeeping missions, so that's a contribution that could be made to Australia's benefit. About the same time, we also had a visit of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and that's hugely important, and I'll have a bit more to say about that in a future podcast and elaborate on the potential defence relationship between Australia and India. I'm not a huge fan of PM Modi's domestic politics, but we'll leave that out of it for the moment. India is a growing military power, and in my opinion, as I've said frequently, Australia needs as many friends in this region as possible to reduce our dependence on the US. By the way, I don't think this realisation has yet reached the government. But the thing that got the headlines, a Chinese missile launch into the South Pacific on the 6th of July. It caused quite a stir, which is to be expected. China's official news agency, Xinhua, issued a short statement saying that it was part of a routine annual training mission. The missile was most likely something called the JL-3, which is a new generation intercontinental ballistic missile that China has displayed publicly. It has a stated range of 10,000 kilometres. And the reason for this missile modernisation is that China's submarines are not yet stealthy enough to evade detection, and so to perform their role of being able to conduct a second strike in the event of a nuclear war, they have to stay in protected waters quite near China. Therefore, the missiles need to be as long range as possible, namely to be able to threaten as much of the continental United States as they can. Now, what I will say about that missile, it doesn't necessarily need to be equipped with a nuclear warhead. You can put high explosive on them if you wish, and that means effectively all of Australia is now in range of that particular weapon. Should we be particularly alarmed or concerned about that? Not for the moment. We shouldn't be panicking, but again, it's just something to keep in mind as China grows in strength and its military modernizes. This is simply a fact of life that we need to be aware of. Now, all of these submarine launches are detectable by the US-Australian early warning systems, the Joint Defence Facility at Pine Gap in the Northern Territory that is part of a US space-based satellite infrared detection system. This program aims to detect and track missiles just after they lift off. When the main rocket motor ignites, you get a very bright flash, particularly in the UV domain. And so we would be aware pretty soon after that happened that a missile was on the way. Now, why did China cause a bit of a stir by firing it into the South Pacific? Well, it's a problem of geography. Missiles have to come down somewhere. And it's best for these sorts of tests, for safety reasons, if they are conducted over the ocean, as indeed many missile tests conducted by the US, France, Britain, and Russia do. The Earth spins quite quickly. The equator is travelling at about 1,600 kilometres per hour, twice the speed of a commercial aircraft. And when you launch a missile, you generally try and take advantage of that. That will boost the speed of the rocket. I won't go into launch trajectory dynamics. It's quite a complex topic. Anyway, so the bottom line is that Chinese rockets fired from the waters off their east coast are going to end up, generally speaking, even further east. And since they are designed to come down rather than go up into orbit, they fly at their maximum height. They're about 1,200 kilometres above the surface of the Earth. And I saw some alarmist reports of, missiles passing over Pacific Island territories. No, at that height, you're not going to see them, you're not going to hear them, you're not going to be aware of them unless you've got very advanced radar systems. And in fact, it looks like the Chinese went to some trouble to make sure that they were steering clear of various inhabited islands, but nevertheless, I do agree it's a destabilizing move. But the point I'm making is that we simply have to get used to this sort of stuff happening. And I do note that the government now seems to be in a bit of a mild panic over the issue of ground-based missile defence systems, because I saw on the weekend they released some information about a Woomera test launch of an SM-2 missile that interfaced with the US system. Let's be clear, that's a naval missile, and if the government is now starting to argue that the solution to Australia's problems is to permanently station RAN ships off every coastal town and military asset, that's clearly ridiculous. Now, I believe what has happened is this, that the Defence Strategic Review, a 2023 document that I believe is fundamentally flawed in a number of aspects, actually kicked the can down the road for acquiring a surface-launched medium-range air defence missile. Now, thankfully, the government and defence woke up to this lapse earlier this year and is now fast-tracking the acquisition of a medium-range surface-to-air missile, but that's going to take a couple of years or more to get something into service. And US stocks of Patriot missiles are declining by the day, particularly as this Middle East conflict reignites and escalates. The decision to acquire a ground-based medium-range surface-to-air missile should have been taken in 2023. But here we are. Now, some words about Canada and their significant decision to acquire 12 conventional diesel-electric submarines from Germany. And you might ask, well, why Canada? There are a few reasons, including, by the way, I note again there was another burst of publicity about Canada's decision to buy Australia's Jawn gingerly over-the-horizon radar for about $2.5 billion. Great export success story for BAE Systems Australia. But back to Canada. It has similar geography to Australia. I mean, it's Arctic, we're much hotter, but it's a very large country with a very large coastline. Now, last week I referred to Richard Marles saying that Australia is a three-ocean navy. Yeah, Indian, Southern Pacific. Oh, Canada is a three-ocean navy as well. They've got Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic. Their economy is similar, as in they export a lot of raw materials. They are Five Eyes country, and they had previously close relationships with the United States, but that is now completely ruptured. Canada, under Prime Minister Carney, has well and truly accepted this rupture. Australia has not. Canada is adopting what I would call is a radical approach to their defence industry. At the moment, Canada imports about 70% of their military equipment from the United States. That's a ratio similar to Australia's. In fact, I think Australia proportionally imports even more. So Canada is now seeking officially to reverse that ratio. They plan over the next 5 years to be producing 70% of their own defence equipment and only importing 30% from the US. I firmly believe Australia should be going down a similar path. But of course we aren't. Our defence industry policy, as far as I'm aware, talks a little bit about self-reliance, but it's nothing like the way that Canada is trying to radically reorient what's going on. Now, the Canadian submarine decision, they have chosen a German-Norwegian called Type 12 CD, common design, and, in quotes, to defend its vast coastline. Note that. Defend its coastline, not to conduct operations in the South China Sea. And I'll say in this context that politicians are all too susceptible to slogans because they think if something sounds good to them, it will also sound good to generally gullible and ill-informed voters, particularly when it comes to complex defence technologies. A phrase that you will frequently hear is submarines are offensive weapons. That comes up all the time. It flows through from that simple idea that since they are offensive weapons, they should be deployed as far forward as possible to maximise damage to the enemy. And while indeed this might be the most effective way of using them, it is not the only way of using them, which is clearly something that Canada has realised, but Australia has not. Now, Canada's new submarines will be used to help give Canada a stronger foothold in the Arctic. The German vessels from TKMS, a company I know well, are designed to use stealth technology and operate in contested areas while remaining close to impossible to detect, and they will be able to conduct lengthy surveillance missions. The Koreans were a little bit unlucky to move out. The shortlist was between a Canadian design and a Korean design. But the Canadians, I believe, have gone for the most modern solution possible, and also the fact that Norway and Germany are NATO members must have helped. I've mentioned the Type 12 CD previously. It has pretty amazing underwater endurance. As I've said, something like 40 days just on its fuel cell alone, with backup electric batteries, which will add some days on top of that. I can state again, this is getting close to the performance of nuclear-powered submarines in terms of endurance. They're not yet there in terms of sustained high speed, but if, as the Canadians are planning to do, you are going to operate them closer to your coastline, then the issue of sustained maximum speed goes away, or at least it becomes far less important. And sooner or later, Australians are going to have to ask the hard question, is it worth spending all of this money and taking all of these risks for a declining number of performance characteristics. The Canadian order is worth an estimated $12 billion US dollars, about 18 billion Australian. And when you take into account all of the through-life costs over the life of the submarine, that probably amounts to a $100 billion Australian order. Still 1/3 of the price that Australia intends paying over a similar period of time. Germany has made a number of economic offers to the Canadians. The submarines will be built in Germany, but they will be fully supported in Canada. A lot of the training will happen in Canada. There's going to be other sweeteners, like Canada will become a hub for the production of torpedoes. The contract has scope to be expanded to include German investments in rare earths, mining, artificial intelligence, and battery production, particularly for the automotive sector. TKMS has said its deal is valued at least 160 billion Canadian dollars and up to 650,000 job years. This has come about because of Canada's industrial policy, something called their Industrial and Technology Benefits Policy, that legally mandates that foreign defence contractors generate local economic activity equal to 100% of the contract's total value. I ask people to contrast that with Australia's completely passive attitude that basically leaves it up to companies to offer as much, or usually as little, as they want in terms of their bids. I also remind people that while Germany will now pour billions of dollars into Canadian industry, Australia is in the process of giving away $10 billion of our money to the defence companies of the United States and the UK. I've said in the past that I am open-minded about the capability that you get with nuclear-powered submarines. I've just acknowledged that they can go faster for longer, but I have also always believed that our approach to this from an industrial policy is completely insane. It is nuts. Just look at what the Canadians are doing, the benefits that are going to flow to their country from buying this German, Norwegian submarine. It's going to benefit them to the tune of massive amounts of money and a huge number of jobs, while we're giving everything away. Now, I'll conclude by saying, why are we doing this? Well, it's because our submariners are fantastic self-promoters, and they have managed to capture politicians. I saw recently that our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, referred to receiving a visit from Chief of Navy Mark Hammond, who had a briefcase chained to his wrist, all of this, very dramatic showmanship, to show photos of a Collins-class submarine taking a picture of a US aircraft carrier, through its periscope, which by definition means if it's close enough to do that, it's close enough to fire a few torpedoes and sink the aircraft carrier. Well, this is not a unique achievement. Other conventional submarines have done the same sort of thing in the past, particularly a Swedish conventional submarine that the United States Navy leased for 2 years between 2005 and 2007. But our politicians are overly impressed with this sort of stuff, and the tendency, therefore, is give the submariners what they want. No, wrong approach. You have to make these things matters for judgment and evaluation, not matters for motion. And I'll conclude, by the way, by revealing something that hasn't been said before publicly. An Australian Collins conventional class submarine has achieved a firing solution on a USN SSN. Think about that. I'll elaborate in the future. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
Vantor delivers sovereign spatial intelligence so nations can own the ground truth. See how at vantor.com.